March 15, 1943. The naval shipyard at La Spezia, Italy. Commander Paolo Marchetti stood in the cavernous metallurgy laboratory, staring at a section of armor plating that had been salvaged from a damaged British cruiser off the coast of Crete. The metal gleamed under the harsh electric lights, unmarred despite having endured direct impacts that should have shattered it. The Italian officer believed this captured steel would finally reveal the secrets that had eluded his nation's shipbuilders for 3 years of conflict. He had no idea he was about to discover something that would shake the foundations of everything Italy's naval engineers thought they understood about their own capabilities. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one piece of captured British armor led Italian metallurgists to confront a devastating truth about industrial warfare, transforming brilliant engineers into witnesses of their own nation's technological limitations, and revealing that the real contest had never been between courage and tactics, but between furnaces, chemistry, and the patient accumulation of industrial knowledge across decades. Commander Marchetti had graduated top of his class from the Royal Naval Academy in 1928. For 15 years he had dedicated himself to understanding the science of naval armor. His team at La Spezia included some of Italy's finest metallurgical minds. Dr. Alberto Rossini, who had studied steel composition in Germany before the conflict, Lieutenant Franco Bianchi, an expert in heat treatment processes, and Maria Castellano, one of the few female engineers in Italy's defense industry whose understanding of crystalline structures was unmatched in the Mediterranean. Together, they had analyzed armor failures from a dozen Italian vessels, always searching for the flaw, the weakness, the mistake that kept their plating from matching British performance. The captured section measured approximately 3 meters by 2 meters, weighing nearly 8,000 kilograms. It had been cut from the belt armor of a vessel that had engaged Italian forces near Alexandria. What made this particular piece extraordinary was its history. According to intelligence reports, this armor had withstood at least 7 direct impacts from Italian naval guns during the engagement, 7 rounds that should have penetrated, 7 failures that had cost Italian ships dearly in the subsequent exchange. Dr. Rossini approached the steel with almost reverential care, running his hand across its surface. The man was 52 years old, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that constantly slipped down his nose. He had spent 3 decades studying metallurgy, had published 17 papers on armor composition, and had overseen the production specifications for Italy's newest battleships. His voice carried a mixture of excitement and something else, something that might have been apprehension. Then Dr. Rossini said, "This is remarkable. Look at the impact points. No cracking, no spalling on the rear face. The deformation is minimal and localized. Our plates would have developed stress fractures radiating outward from these impact sites." Lieutenant Bianchi nodded, making notes in his leather journal. The young officer was 28, energetic, and convinced that every problem had a solution waiting to be discovered. He had joined the metallurgy division, believing that Italian ingenuity would eventually close any gap with British industry. His optimism was about to be tested in ways he could not imagine. Maria Castellano stood slightly apart from the men, her dark eyes studying the steel with an intensity that made Marchetti uncomfortable. She was 35, had fought for every opportunity in a field dominated by men, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to see patterns others missed. She had been quiet since the armor arrived, which was unusual. Maria always had observations, questions, challenges. Her silence worried Marchetti more than any technical problem. Then Maria said, "We should begin with spectroscopic analysis, determine the exact composition. Then we can move to microstructure examination and hardness testing across multiple points." The team worked through the night. The spectroscopic equipment, German-made and installed just 6 months earlier, revealed the chemical composition with precision. Iron, of course, forming the base, carbon at approximately 0.35%, manganese at 1.2%, small amounts of chromium, nickel, and molybdenum. The ratios were not dramatically different from Italian armor specifications. If anything, the British steel contained slightly less of the expensive alloying elements Italy struggled to obtain. Lieutenant Bianchi seemed relieved. He said, "The composition is similar to our own armor." perhaps slightly inferior in some respects. The nickel content is lower than what we use in our latest vessels. But Dr. Rossini frowned, adjusting his spectacles. He said, "Composition is only part of the equation. The secret must lie in the processing. The heat treatment, the forging technique, the cooling rates. These factors determine the final microstructure, and microstructure determines performance. They cut samples from various locations on the captured plate, preparing them with meticulous care. The specimens were mounted, ground, polished to a mirror finish, and then etched with chemical solutions that would reveal the internal grain structure under microscopic examination. This was painstaking work, requiring hours of preparation before they could even begin to draw conclusions. When Maria finally looked through the metallurgical microscope at the first prepared sample, she went very still. Marchetti watched her face change, saw something like recognition cross her features, followed immediately by what looked like dismay. She adjusted the focus, moved to higher magnification, checked the sample preparation to ensure she was not seeing an artifact of their process. Then she stepped back from the microscope without speaking. Then Maria said, "Dr. Rossini, you need to see this." The older man took her place at the microscope. Marchetti watched his mentor's face as he examined the British steel's internal structure. Rossini's expression shifted from curiosity to concentration to something approaching disbelief. He spent 10 minutes at the microscope, checking multiple locations on the sample, before he finally straightened and removed his spectacles to clean them, a nervous habit Marchetti had observed whenever the doctor was processing difficult information. Then Dr. Rossini said, "The grain structure is extraordinary, extremely fine and uniform. The perlite distribution is nearly perfect. And the banding, there is almost no compositional banding whatsoever. This is not just good steel. This is steel produced with a level of process control I have never personally observed." Lieutenant Bianchi moved to the microscope, eager to see for himself. His enthusiasm dimmed as he studied the sample. He said, "But how is this possible? Their composition is not superior. How can the microstructure be so refined?" Maria had moved to the window, staring out at the darkened shipyard. She spoke without turning around. She said, "It is not one thing, it is everything. Every step of their process is optimized. The steel making, the forging, the heat treatment, the quality control. They have achieved a level of consistency that requires infrastructure we simply do not possess." Commander Marchetti felt something cold settling in his stomach. He said, "Explain what you mean by infrastructure." Maria turned to face the room. She said, "To produce steel like this requires multiple factors working in concert. First, the raw steel-making process must be extremely clean. Impurities must be minimized. That requires high-quality ore, precise temperature control in the furnaces, and careful desulfurization. Then the ingots must be forged using heavy hydraulic presses to break up any residual casting structure. The British have presses capable of exerting 12,000 tons of force. Our largest press operates at 4,000 tons. She moved to the blackboard and began sketching diagrams as she spoke. Her voice took on a lecturing quality, as if teaching helped her organize her thoughts. She said, "After forging, the plates must be heat-treated with extraordinary precision. This means heating to exactly the right temperature, which varies depending on thickness and composition, holding at that temperature for the correct duration, and then cooling at a controlled rate. Too fast and you get brittleness, too slow and you do not achieve proper hardness. The British have developed furnaces with thermocouples placed throughout, giving them temperature uniformity within 5 degrees across the entire piece. Our furnaces can vary by 50 degrees or more." Dr. Rossini had sat down heavily in a chair. He said, "And the cooling process?" Maria nodded. She said, "Even more critical. They use oil quenching with forced circulation. The oil temperature is monitored and maintained precisely. They can control cooling rates in different parts of the plate to account for thickness variations. After quenching, tempering must be done with equal precision. This determines the final balance between hardness and toughness. The British appear to have mastered this completely." Lieutenant Bianchi's optimism was cracking. He said, "But surely we can replicate these processes. We have skilled workers, competent engineers. We can build better furnaces, install better controls." The silence that followed his statement stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Commander Marchetti spoke. He said, "How long would it take to develop these capabilities, to build the necessary equipment?" Maria looked at each of them in turn. She said, "If we started today with unlimited resources and no constraints, perhaps 5 to 7 years to achieve comparable results. But we do not have unlimited resources. Our industrial capacity is already strained. The specialized equipment would need to be manufactured, which requires machine tools we currently do not have. Those machine tools would need to be built using other equipment we also lack. It is a problem of compounding deficiencies." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Marchetti realized he was witnessing something profound, a moment when theoretical understanding collided with practical reality. These brilliant engineers, people who had dedicated their lives to their craft, were confronting the limits of what determination and intelligence could achieve without the underlying industrial foundation. Over the following weeks, the team conducted every test they could devise. They measured hardness at hundreds of points across the British armour. The readings were remarkably consistent, varying by less than 5%. When they tested Italian armour plates, even the best ones' variations exceeded 20%. They conducted impact tests on samples, examining how cracks propagated through the material. The British steel showed crack arrest mechanisms that Italian plates lacked. They studied the armour that had been removed from damaged Italian ships, comparing failure modes. Dr. Rossini compiled a comprehensive report. The document ran to 87 pages and included microscopic photographs, hardness maps, chemical analyses, and detailed comparisons. The conclusion was inescapable. British armour superiority stemmed not from secret formulas or revolutionary designs, but from the patient accumulation of industrial capabilities across decades. Their steel mills had been producing high-quality armour since the 1890s. They had refined their processes through thousands of production runs, learned from countless batches, invested in incremental improvements year after year. Italy had tried to catch up quickly, to leapfrog 50 years of British industrial development in a single decade. The country had built shipyards and foundries, had trained engineers and workers, had studied foreign techniques. But there was no shortcut to the kind of process maturity the British had achieved. Every step of steel production required not just knowledge but experience, institutional memory and infrastructure, built on earlier infrastructure. Commander Marchetti requested a meeting with Admiral Giuseppe Fioravanzo, the senior officer overseeing naval construction. The meeting took place in early May, in an office overlooking the harbour where Italian warships sat at anchor, their armour plating concealing the flaws that Marchetti now understood so clearly. The Admiral was a formidable man, 60 years old, with a reputation for not tolerating excuses. He listened to Marchetti's briefing without interruption, studying the photographs and data the commander presented. When Marchetti finished, Fioravanzo sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then Admiral Fioravanzo said, "So you are telling me that our armour is fundamentally inferior, and there is nothing we can do about it in the near term?" Marchetti chose his words carefully. He said, "Admiral, our armour functions adequately when not subjected to direct comparison with British production. The problem is that in naval engagements, direct comparison is unavoidable. Our ships face British ships. Our armour fails where theirs does not. This creates a tactical disadvantage that courage and skill cannot overcome." The Admiral stood and walked to the window. He said, "I served on cruisers during the last conflict. I have spent 40 years in the Navy. I watched us build a modern fleet, watched our industrial capacity grow. I believed we had achieved parity with Britain in naval construction. You are saying this belief was mistaken." Marchetti felt the weight of the moment. He said, "We achieved parity in many areas. Ship design, propulsion systems, fire control mechanisms. But in armour metallurgy specifically, we are approximately a generation behind. Perhaps more in some respects." The Admiral turned back to face him. He said, "How did this happen? We have engineers as intelligent as theirs. Our workers are skilled and dedicated. We invested heavily in modernization." This was the question Marchetti had been asking himself. He said, "Intelligence and dedication are necessary but not sufficient. Industrial capability is built on accumulated infrastructure and experience. The British have been operating large-scale steel mills for over a century. They made mistakes, learned from them, and refined their processes before we even began. They have training programs that span decades, institutional knowledge passed from master craftsmen to apprentices. They have supply chains optimized through generations of refinement. We tried to build this in 15 years. It was never realistic. Admiral Fioravanzo returned to his desk and sat down heavily. He said, "This information cannot become widely known. Morale is fragile enough without our personnel learning that our ships are inherently disadvantaged. What do you recommend?" Marchetti had anticipated this question. He said, "We continue improving what we can, optimize our processes within current limitations, focus on tactics that minimize exposure to direct armor engagements, and we document everything we learn for future reference so that when this conflict ends, we have a foundation to build upon." The Admiral nodded slowly. He said, "Prepare a restricted circulation report. Technical recommendations only, no strategic assessments. Send it through my office. And Commander, I appreciate your honesty." Many officers would have tried to hide this or minimize it. Marchetti saluted and left. Walking back through the shipyard, he passed workers cutting armor plates, welders joining sections, engineers checking specifications, all of them working with dedication and skill, all of them constrained by factors beyond their control. Back in the laboratory, Maria Castellano had continued analyzing the British steel. She had discovered something else, something that made the picture even clearer. The armor showed evidence of non-destructive testing, inspection techniques that allowed the British to verify internal quality without damaging the plates. X-ray radiography, ultrasonic inspection, magnetic particle testing. The British were inspecting every plate thoroughly before installation, catching defects that Italian production would never detect until failure in combat. She showed her findings to Dr. Rossini. The old man studied her data and nodded slowly. He said, "Of course. Quality control is not just about making good steel, it is about knowing which steel is good. They can reject defective plates before installation. We cannot, so our ships carry armor with hidden flaws we only discover in action." Maria said, "There is something else. I found production markings on the plate. Date stamps, heat numbers, inspector signatures. They track each piece of armor from raw steel to installation. If a problem emerges, they can trace it back to the specific batch, the specific furnace, the specific shift. They learn from every failure. We do not have such systems." Dr. Rossini removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. He said, "Maria, you are describing an entire philosophy of manufacturing. Not just making things, but understanding how you make things. Measuring, tracking, analyzing, improving. This is what separates mature industry from ambitious industry." Lieutenant Bianchi had been listening. He said, "So what do we do?" "Accept that we cannot compete." Maria turned to face him. She said, "We compete with what we have. We design ships that minimize armor reliance. We develop tactics that exploit our advantages in speed and maneuverability. We focus our limited high-quality armor on critical areas and accept more risk elsewhere. And we learn so that someday, when circumstances permit, we can build the industrial capacity we lack today." The young lieutenant looked frustrated. He said, "That feels like admitting defeat before we begin." Dr. Rossini shook his head. He said, "It is the opposite. It is refusing to delude ourselves. The French tried to match everyone in every category and built a military that was mediocre at everything. The British built on their industrial strengths. We must do the same. Understand our limitations and work within them while we develop capabilities for the future." As spring turned to summer, the team completed their analysis. They had tested dozens of samples from the captured British armor and compared them against Italian production from 3 different foundries. The results were consistent. British steel showed superior grain refinement, better hardness uniformity, fewer internal defects, and more reliable performance under stress. The gap was not enormous in any single metric, but the combination of many small advantages created a significant overall superiority. Commander Marchetti compiled the final report in June of 1943. He included technical details, but also broader observations about industrial development and the nature of technological competition between nations. He wrote that armor superiority was not about individual genius or revolutionary discoveries, but about the patient accumulation of incremental improvements across generations. He noted that Italy had attempted to compress this development into too short a time frame, and that while the country had achieved remarkable progress, some gaps could not be closed quickly, no matter how much will or talent was applied. The report circulated among a small group of senior officers and technical specialists. Marchetti never learned what decisions, if any, resulted from his findings. Ships continued to be built with Italian armor because there was no alternative. Engagements continued to occur, and sometimes Italian vessels prevailed through superior tactics or favorable circumstances, while other times British armor advantages proved decisive. But the experience changed everyone involved in the analysis. Dr. Rossini retired from naval work in 1944, taking a position at a university where he taught metallurgy to a new generation. His lectures emphasized not just the science of metals, but the broader context of industrial development, the infrastructure required to translate knowledge into capability. Maria Castellano continued working in materials science, eventually becoming a consultant on post-conflict industrial reconstruction. Lieutenant Bianchi left the Navy after the war and worked for a steel company, applying lessons learned to civilian production. Commander Marchetti remained in naval service until 1951. He carried with him a profound understanding that conflicts were decided by more than courage or tactics. They were decided by furnaces and forges, by quality control systems and institutional knowledge, by the accumulated capabilities of entire societies. One side could be braver, more dedicated, more tactically brilliant, and still lose because the other side had built better factories decades earlier. The captured British armor remained at La Spezia, used for training and research through the war's end. In later years, it became a teaching tool, a tangible example of what industrial maturity looked like. Students would examine the fine grain structure, the uniform hardness, the careful composition control, and they would understand that excellence in manufacturing was not about dramatic breakthroughs, but about doing 10,000 small things correctly, every time across years and decades. The irony was not lost on Marchetti. Italy had captured this British steel, hoping to find weaknesses, secrets that could be exploited. Instead, they had found a mirror that reflected their own limitations. The armor had not revealed British vulnerabilities. It had revealed Italian ones, not vulnerabilities of courage or intelligence, but vulnerabilities of infrastructure and time, of industrial foundations that could not be built overnight, no matter how urgent the need. In his final report, Marchetti included a section on lessons for future development. He wrote that nations seeking industrial parity with established powers needed to think in terms of generations, not years. They needed to invest not just in factories, but in the education systems that produced engineers, the research institutions that developed new techniques, the apprenticeship programs that passed knowledge from master to student. They needed to build supply chains, develop quality control systems, establish standards and testing protocols. All of this took time, more time than political or military urgency usually allowed. He also noted that there were no shortcuts, a lesson that applied far beyond armor production. You could not buy maturity. You could purchase equipment and hire consultants, but you could not purchase the accumulated experience of operating that equipment for decades, of making mistakes and learning from them, of building institutional knowledge that lived in the collective memory of workers and engineers. This had to be earned through practice, and practice required time. The captured British armor had taught them that industrial warfare was exactly that, industrial. The side with better factories had an advantage that tactics and courage could mitigate but rarely overcome. Britain had been building its industrial capacity since the early 1800s. Italy had started seriously industrializing in the late 1800s, 4 or 5 decades later. That gap of 50 years could not be closed in 10, no matter how much effort was applied. As Marchetti prepared to retire in 1951, he visited the laboratory at La Spezia one final time. The captured armor was still there, now surrounded by samples from various nations. a collection of metallurgical achievements that served as reference standards. Maria Castellano was there, consulting on a project involving new steel alloys. She had aged well, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had proven herself repeatedly in a field that had not welcomed her easily. They stood together, looking at the British armour that had started them on a journey of understanding years earlier. Then Maria said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never captured this piece, if we had never analysed it so thoroughly?" Marchetti considered the question. He said, "We would have continued believing that small improvements to our processes would eventually close the gap. We would have been wrong, but perhaps the illusion would have been preferable to the reality." Maria shook her head. She said, "I prefer knowledge to illusions, even when knowledge is uncomfortable." We learned something important. Industrial capability cannot be rushed. Excellence requires time and patience and accumulated experience. These are lessons that apply far beyond armor production. Marchetti smiled. He said, "You sound like you are preparing a lecture." Maria said, "I am always preparing a lecture. Someone needs to ensure the next generation understands these things, so they do not make the same mistakes we did." They walked out of the laboratory together, leaving the captured British steel behind. It would remain there for decades, eventually finding its way into a museum where visitors could see it without understanding what it represented. They would read plaques describing its composition and properties, but they would not feel what Marchetti and his team had felt when they realized what this armor meant, what it revealed about the nature of industrial competition between nations. The steel had been more than just metal. It had been a lesson delivered with absolute clarity about the relationship between time and capability, between infrastructure and performance. It had shown them that some problems could not be solved by intelligence or will alone, that excellence required foundations built across generations, and it had transformed them from engineers confident in their abilities into witnesses of a larger truth about how industrial societies developed and competed. The British had not built better armor through genius or secret formulas. They had built it through a century of patient improvement, through investments made by previous generations, through systems and institutions developed long before the current conflict began. Italy had tried to compress this development, to achieve in 15 years what Britain had taken 80 to build. The captured armor was the proof that such compression was impossible, that some achievements could only come through time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.